This episode is brought to you by The Skeptical Buddha, The Tao of Science, my book, which is a thoughtful discourse on Eastern philosophy and how it helped birth ideas required for science and skepticism and the way it fell behind in the face of new evidence. This book discusses the long history of both philosophies as well as the tenets and variations within the varying sects, along with psychology and our own natural biases. It discusses how to counter our natural biases using science and the underlying concepts of meditation and mindfulness, a more complex understanding of how science operates than most of the public understands, and why it is the best tool we have to discover truth and reality, as well as philosophical ideas we might embrace as technology progresses. The material is packaged in a way that the average person can understand, with rich illustrations to draw the reader in and feel at peace. Out of nowhere in the last 5 years, the hatred against landlords enveloped the left on the internet. My mom was a landlord for a while. Why is she suddenly the spawn of Satan to leftists? Well, it's not the individual landlords themselves, it's the larger systematic issue that wreaks havoc on the economy, exploiting the poor and middle class in general. First, we should define a landlord. A landlord is anyone who owns private land and housing and rents it out to others for a contractual period of time. While this does require money to cover, say, property taxes, mortgage, convenience of being able to move without having to sell, and maintenance, the landlord also gets more than that based on the market price, and here is where renting gets downright evil. In theory, they should get some compensation for their services of upkeep and potential risk on loans and other issues. However, the problem is similar to the problem in Monopoly. If you start early in the game, you're able to jack up the rates so that people starting later in the game are beholden to the prices you decide. That means it's even worse than the game of Monopoly. When a person owns one house, that is something we should be entitled to. The more houses they own, the more scarcity they create in housing. With that scarcity, the price of housing overall will rise. Over time, the gap between compensation for a service and skimming off extra goes up. Property value goes up, raising taxes paid on the property, raising property rates. With a scarcity of housing created by people renting instead of owning, renters are at the mercy of the owners. That skimming is just a normal thing, which is why investing in property as a landlord is viewed as really lucrative, and why people like the Trumps made such a fortune in it. Some were driven to innovate, such as building taller in prime real estate, but many were just as likely to take advantage of the situation. Making money without labor was considered unethical by both Marx and many of the founding fathers. The slave owners said they also did, but we're actually cool with it so long as those people were not their property. Reward for risk is also something people believe in, but the risk in terms of being a landlord is pretty low compared to, say, starting a business. The amount of labor that goes into it may feel high, but if you're making more than the market labor rates for the same labor, then there is also an issue. Even worse, large Wall Street companies will buy up real estate in large amounts for high amounts, and rent increases even more. Once rent gets too high, people end up homeless. It's a vicious cycle. As property values rise, there is only really a drive to build more luxury houses, as the margin between building what people can afford and the cost of materials, which have also risen with the shortages, is very tight. At that point, there becomes a glut of housing no one can afford to buy, but the profits on those apartments outweighs the waste to surplus of unaffordable housing. In the concert industry, buying something you aren't going to use to sell at a higher price is called scalping. Now imagine it's a concert you have to live, and the stock market speculators invest in scalping, and you get the modern housing industry. It's why I laughed when a tweet came through and said that landlord was just the PC term for housing scalper. There is nothing wrong with renting when some risk and maintenance is actually a job one puts labor into. There's nothing evil about making some small profit off of risk and a decent profit off of labor put into maintaining the place. The problem is, like in the game of Monopoly, housing becomes more and more scarce as people view housing as an investment to be speculated on instead of a job. This puts housing prices at the whim of a large market, and Wall Street begins investing in renting houses, which jacks up the price more and more. This in turn causes the price of all housing to go up, as this artificial speculative demand continues to skyrocket the prices, ensuring we have more empty homes than homeless people. The next generations are coming up and having to take on more and more debt than their parents ever did just to be a homeowner. Renting in and of itself isn't evil. German-style rent control, American-style is stupid, is essentially a maximum wage on all landlords that prevent this monopoly-style cascade from occurring, ensuring that in the most expensive city in Germany, you can rent a decent place for around $500 and a hostel for $10 a night, though they are going through a housing crisis thanks to the Airbnb phenomena that it's cheaper to rent out a place for higher prices for a few nights than a yearly contract. This also would make a nationwide minimum wage make more sense, as the disparity in real estate costs between rural and urban would not be nearly as insane. In America, this is just a stupid concept, as property values in the US are so different region to region, it literally makes money worth completely different amounts, just from county to county. So are all landlords evil? Well, a housing renter in and of itself is not evil, but a lord is someone with prior legacy wealth who then uses that wealth to skim off the peasants. So yes, until there is some major overhaul, such as decoupling Wall Street from housing like Elizabeth Warren ran on, and creating a rental maximum wage such as in Germany, all landlords are making more than they should just because they were able to scalp a place they aren't going to use for their needs before the rest of us got ours, just due to how time flows, jacking up all our housing prices and making way more money than their labor, risk, and convenience they provide deserves. However, putting a maximum wage on renting or creating a public option like Austria did very well prior to the Nazi takeover, and America did during the 1950s for veterans, would impact the economy, which is why no one with any power, especially in the middle class, wants. If you already own a home or owned one starting in the 1980s, the value of your home went up and continues to go up much higher than inflation. A $200,000 home is now worth about $1 million today. Thanks to supply and demand, lowering rent prices would then lower the demand for housing, which would then lower the market value of homes. This means if you already had a home, you would suddenly feel poorer even if you had the same asset you had before, you just can't sell it for as much. Therefore, the upper middle class especially has zero interest in changing the trend because they want their real estate to appreciate and not go down in value so they can make a profit off of it if they sell it for retirement. It's this mindset that is why there is little drive to fix the problem, even as the homeless live on the streets, and the rest of us can't afford to do anything but rent and not accumulate wealth or savings, as instead of paying rent to ourselves for much less, we will be paying rent to a landlord for much more. This is why many are saying it's not just the top 1% that are the problem. Without the top 10 to 20% acting as shields to protect them to create their own exclusive club to act as a buffer for the top 1%, they couldn't do what they do. The top 10 to 20% own most of the real estate because they are a larger group than the 1%. They also set the standards for elite schools and are the ones most likely to push racist policies and be segregationist in practice thanks to NIMBY. It's why Johnny Harris made his video pointing out that in many ways, purely because of upper middle class NIMBYism, liberal states are in some ways less affordable and worse to the poor than Republican states, even though in their minds they are better to the poor and emotionally want to help the poor, just not in their backyard. With this in mind, the entire system is unethical and creates a massive power grab. When the free market stops being about most efficiently distributing needs, especially for things that are essential to survive, it instead starts becoming a power grab, and it's broken. It's why having a public option for housing, as I mentioned in my video on how to fix the housing crisis and fix some of the racial inequality by just giving black veterans who were denied the housing benefits white people got after World War II, or a maximum wage, becomes essential to make essential things affordable to people at the bottom so they actually have a chance to lift themselves up and build wealth. Instead, they're blamed for not working hard, even though thanks to having zero power, because of the power grab, they work way more than anyone else at the top, or end up suffering burnout and mental health issues and drop out of the workforce entirely. This is what is referred to as late-stage capitalism, where the free market stops being about the most efficient distribution of goods and just becomes what is known as rent-seeking, from housing to patents to, at this point, not even being able to fix and repair things you own like your phones, computers, or tractors. If it wasn't a power and wealth grab, and we had good checks in place to prevent a cascade effect, as the game of Monopoly predicted, then there would be no ethical issue with being a landlord. It would just be a job with labor, along with providing a service and a small risk risk that should be rewarded. Instead, it's now a stratified power grab preventing the poor and young from moving up, and the rich and upper middle class to become gatekeepers to that wealth and opportunity. So yes, a landlord as a job and service can be an ethical occupation in a regulated housing economy, but in this economy, not even a little. But thanks to the banality of evil and the dilution of responsibility that capitalism has and always provides, people can be perfectly nice people and still contribute to evil as long as it becomes the norm and they're all invested in the chain of responsibility and deniability. They aren't going to change anything, and it creates a humanitarian catastrophe with such ridiculous numbers of people who are homeless and economic hopelessness, causing us to have the highest number of prisoners in the world just after North Korea. And even if the worst case figures about Xinjiang and re-education camps about China are correct, they still have 1/3 less prisoners than we do. But since we set the supposed global moral standard of the world, they can continue to get away with what they do because they can go, hey, we aren't nearly as bad as the US in this area. This is why there is so much landlord hate. Yet to people who are homeowners, many don't understand, and it feels like an inside joke because they don't understand this complex knock-on effect their rising home value is causing. So they just assume, like with ACAB, that the younger and more lefty folks are just spoiled, entitled, and don't understand how money in reality works, even though they are the ones in this case who don't understand it. Like with ACAB, used to attack a system with zero extra information or nuance to break down why all cops, no matter how well-intentioned, contribute to a horrible, corrupt institution of unchecked injustice, the same is true with the landlord hate. To people in the know, it's funny. To people who aren't, it just turns off a large segment of the population and shuts down all discussion before it can even begin, slowing down how long it will take to actually fix this issue. So as always, thank you all for watching this as a video or listening to this as a podcast, which I'm sure was completely uncontroversial to anyone, especially to the YouTube monetization team. So if you found this useful, please donate to my Patreon. Just a reminder that I'm Anubis2814 on YouTube, and I have almost 700 videos on my channel that I've made over the past 11 years on religion, science, psychology, and politics. Please go check them out, and if your site has the option, like, rate, review, and comment. A special thanks goes out to Kendall Copperberg, Mylon Mia, Ogrel, Elias Garcia Guevara, and Joe Taylor for their $10 or more Wapawet level donations. I'm always humbled by the fact that they find my work worth funding and worth driving me forward. Thank you all. Please consider donating to my work if you can, and thank you all for listening.